Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? The woods were always quiet, but it wasn't the usual kind of peaceful quiet. This was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, as though the trees were listening to you, watching you, waiting for something to happen. It was a calm afternoon when I first stumbled upon the cabin. I had been hiking, just exploring the trails near the edge of the forest, not expecting to find anything more than trees, dirt paths, and the occasional deer, but the cabin appeared suddenly, standing at the base of a small hill, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick underbrush. It was hidden so well, as if it had been placed there, intentionally obscured from the eyes of anyone who passed by. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I had been walking for hours, the path narrowing as the trees grew denser. But when I stopped to rest and wiped the sweat from my brow, I saw it again, the cabin, old and weathered, half covered in ivy, with a broken chimney jutting out at an odd angle. Its roof sagged slightly, and the windows were clouded with dirt, making it hard to see inside. The door, slightly ajar, swayed gently with the wind, like it was beckoning me to come closer. I wasn't sure why, but something about it intrigued me. I had been on my own for most of the hike, away from any trailheads or marked paths. So the thought of finding a cabin deep in the woods felt strange, even unsettling. But curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to approach it. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that blanketed the ground. As I reached the front porch, I noticed the boards creaked slightly beneath my feet, groaning under the weight of years of neglect. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. It swung inward with a reluctant creak, the air inside musty and stale, like something had been locked away for a long time. I stepped into the cabin, my heart racing, with a mix of excitement and caution. The floorboards were uneven beneath my feet, and dust hung in the air like a fog, disturbed by my entry. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me, but it wasn't just quiet. It was an unnatural quiet, one that seemed to close in around me, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something. The cabin was small, but well built. The wooden walls lined with faded wallpaper that had started to peel at the edges. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, the hearth cold and empty. On the floor lay a few old rugs, their fibers matted and worn, and a table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if someone had walked out one day and never returned. I moved further into the cabin, my eyes scanning the room. On the table, I noticed a few scattered papers, yellowed with age. I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued, and picked one up. It was a letter, its ink faded and hard to read, but the name at the top stood out, Adeline. It was the only word that was legible, written in a neat, careful hand. But the rest of the letter was incomprehensible. The words a blur, as if the paper had been damaged by years of neglect. I set it down, feeling a strange chill run through me. Who had written this? Who was Adeline? I walked further into the cabin, my mind racing with thoughts of the people who had lived here. What had happened to them? Why had they left? The stillness in the air was thick with unanswered questions. I moved toward a small door at the back of the room, which led to a dark hallway. The floor creaked beneath me as I stepped down the narrow passage, and I could feel the weight of the darkness ahead. At the end of the hallway, there was a small room, its door cracked open just enough for me to peek inside. The room was dim, but I could make out the shape of a bed against the far wall, its sheets tattered and faded. A small wooden dresser stood next to it, the drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood and decay. But what struck me most was the window. It was open just a crack, and through the dirty glass, I could see the trees outside swaying in the breeze. But the room was still. I stepped inside, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe, my eyes scanning the room. On the floor, next to the bed, lay something I hadn't noticed at first, a small, old-fashioned doll. It was worn, its clothes tattered, but its face was strange. It wasn't the usual lifeless blank stare that you'd expect from a doll. This one seemed too real. The eyes were too dark, too full of something I couldn't name. As I picked it up, the hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I immediately set it back down, almost dropping it in my haste. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. There had to be a rational explanation for everything, but the longer I stood there, the more the air around me seemed to thicken. It was as if the cabin itself was breathing with me, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive. I turned to leave the room, but as I stepped back into the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had been wide open when I first came in, was now shut. The air felt colder, denser. The silence was no longer just quiet, it was suffocating. I could feel it. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. I went back toward the front door, thinking that maybe I had seen enough. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and I was suddenly aware of the heavy stillness that clung to every inch of the space. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. There, on the floor by the entrance, was something new. A footprint. The dust had been disturbed, and the print was fresh, the outline of a boot clear in the thin layer of dirt. It didn't make sense. No one had been here for years. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my breathing felt too loud, too panicked. The cabin, the walls, the air around me, it all felt wrong. I had to leave. But as I turned to look one last time at the room, I noticed something else, the doll. It wasn't where I had left it. It was in the center of the room, sitting upright on the bed, facing the door. Its dark eyes stared directly at me, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone. The cabin had never been abandoned. It had been waiting, watching, and now it wouldn't let me leave. The rain had been falling steadily for hours. A constant tap against the roof of the small cabin where I'd been staying for the last few days. It wasn't much, a wooden structure, weathered with age and the wear of seasons, nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. I had come here for peace, to get away from the noise of the city and to clear my head. The isolation had seemed perfect, the kind of quiet I was desperate for, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of animals outside. The kind of quiet that, on some level, I thought I needed. I wasn't alone, not exactly. I had met Mara. the woman who owned the cabin. Through an acquaintance who had described her as someone who had lived here for years, a woman accustomed to solitude. She lived in a small town nearby, but came to the cabin when the world became too much for her. I had arrived at her place a few days ago, and she had offered me the cabin as a place to stay while I got my bearings. We exchanged pleasantries, and over the course of the last few days, I had gotten to know her in a way that felt almost detached. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was private, and there was always something about her manner that made me feel like there were things she wasn't saying, things she was withholding. The rain had begun to fall harder that evening, a relentless downpour that kept me indoors, with no company but the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers and the warmth of the small wood stove in the corner. Mara had told me to stay inside, especially when the weather turned. She said that it was safer, that the woods were unpredictable, and that there were things out there, things you didn't want to encounter when the storms were this intense. I had taken her words lightly at first. It sounded like an old superstition, a warning from someone who had spent too many years alone in the woods. But something about her eyes when she said it made me hesitate. It was the way her gaze darted toward the windows, the way her hands lingered on the doorframe, as if she were waiting for something. That evening, after dinner, Mara went into town for supplies, leaving me in the cabin alone. The storm was still raging outside, and the world beyond the cabin's windows seemed to blur into a wall of gray. The fire crackled softly in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I found myself feeling uneasy, though I couldn't say exactly why. The quiet seemed heavier now, as if the storm outside had brought a new weight to the air. I was sitting near the window, staring out at the darkened woods, when I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, the rain blurring everything into distorted shapes. But then I saw it again, clearly this time, a person standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the thick brush. They weren't moving, just standing there, still as stone, their outline barely visible in the shadows. The figure was tall, slender, and dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden by the fall of their hood. The longer I stared, the more my heart began to race. Who could it be? The storm had driven Mara away to town, and no one else was supposed to be out here. I stood up, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I thought I should call Mara, but the phone had no signal out here. I hadn't seen a soul for days, and I was suddenly acutely aware of how isolated the cabin really was. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave the window. I had the strangest urge to just keep watching, waiting for the figure to move, to do something, anything, but it didn't. Just stood there, staring into the woods. It wasn't until the figure stepped forward, moving ever so slowly, that I felt my breath catch in my throat. The movement was deliberate, calculated. They didn't hurry, they didn't stumble. They moved like someone who had all the time in the world, but they also moved toward the cabin. That was when I knew something was wrong. I stepped back from the window, my legs trembling. The figure wasn't just standing anymore. They were walking towards the cabin. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't want to know. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind, but none of them made sense. The storm outside, the isolation of the woods, the sudden appearance of this figure, it all felt wrong. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself that I was overreacting. It was probably just someone lost in the storm. Mara had told me about the occasional hiker who wandered too far into the woods, but something inside me refused to believe that. I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wasn't lost. They had been watching the cabin, and they were coming closer. I grabbed the lantern from the table and turned off the stove, trying to make the place look empty, hoping they would just pass by. But my eyes kept returning to the window, to the figure that was now much closer, just beyond the edge of the porch. They were close enough now that I could see their features, or rather, I couldn't. Their face was hidden by the shadows, and the rain soaked through their clothes, making their movements even more eerie, like a person who wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. And Mara hadn't said anything about being back early. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I couldn't move. I stood there, listening to the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, wondering what to do. The person outside didn't speak, just waited, as if they knew I was inside. I didn't know who it was, but I didn't want to find out. I decided not to answer. I stayed still, my eyes glued to the door, my hand trembling against the edge of the table. But when I looked out the window again, the figure was gone. I couldn't believe it. One moment they had been right there, standing in front of the porch, and the next, nothing. The figure had vanished. But just as I thought I had imagined it all, I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, too soft to make out, but it came from behind the door, from the dark, from the outside. And then I heard it again, louder this time, and I recognized the voice. Asterisk, stay inside, don't open the door. It was Mara. I didn't know how she had gotten back, or how she knew what was happening, but I wasn't about to question it. Took a deep breath, my mind still spinning, and moved to the back of the cabin, away from the door, away from the window. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't leave the cabin that night, I couldn't. But when morning came and the rain had stopped, the figure was gone, and Mara was still nowhere to be found. The door was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of anyone who had been there. I left the cabin later that day, unable to explain what had happened, what I had seen. And even though the cabin looked just as it had before, I knew one thing for sure. Whoever had been outside that night, whoever had knocked on that door, was still out there watching. And maybe, just maybe, Mara had known all along. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a constant tap against the roof of the small cabin where I'd been staying for the last few days. It wasn't much, a wooden structure weathered with age and the wear of seasons, nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. I had come here for peace, to get away from the noise of the city and to clear my head. The isolation had seemed perfect. The kind of quiet I was desperate for, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of animals outside. The kind of quiet that, on some level, I thought I needed. I wasn't alone, not exactly. I had met Mara, the woman who owned the cabin, through an acquaintance who had described her as someone who had lived here for years, a woman accustomed to solitude. She lived in a small town nearby but came to the cabin when the world became too much for her. I had arrived at her place a few days ago, and she had offered me the cabin as a place to stay while I got my bearings. We exchanged pleasantries, and over the course of the last few days, I had gotten to know her in a way that felt almost detached. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was private, and there was always something about her manner that made me feel like there were things she wasn't saying, things she was withholding. The rain had begun to fall harder that evening, a relentless downpour that kept me indoors, with no company but the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers and the warmth of the small wood stove in the corner. Mara had told me to stay inside, especially when the weather turned. She said that it was safer, that the woods were unpredictable, and that there were things out there, things you didn't want to encounter when the storms were this intense. I had taken her words lightly at first. It sounded like an old superstition, a warning from someone who had spent too many years alone in the woods. But something about her eyes when she said it made me hesitate. It was the way her gaze darted toward the windows, the way her hands lingered on the doorframe, as if she were waiting for something. That evening, after dinner, Mara went into town for supplies, leaving me in the cabin alone. The storm was still raging outside, and the world beyond the cabin's windows seemed to blur into a wall of gray. The fire crackled softly in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I found myself feeling uneasy, though I couldn't say exactly why. The quiet seemed heavier now, as if the storm outside had brought a new weight to the air. I was sitting near the window, staring out at the darkened woods, when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, the rain blurring everything into distorted shapes. But then, I saw it again, clearly this time, a person standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the thick brush. They weren't moving, just standing there, still as stone, their outline barely visible in the shadows. The figure was tall, slender, and dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden by the fall of their hood. The longer I stared, the more my heart began to race. Who could it be? The storm had driven Mara away to town, and no one else was supposed to be out here. I stood up, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I thought I should call Mara, but the phone had no signal out here. I hadn't seen a soul for days, and I was suddenly acutely aware of how isolated the cabin really was. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave the window. I had the strangest urge to just keep watching, waiting for the figure to move, to do something, anything, but it didn't. It just stood there, staring into the woods. It wasn't until the figure stepped forward, moving ever so slowly, that I felt my breath catch in my throat. The movement was deliberate, calculated. They didn't hurry, they didn't stumble. They moved like someone who had all the time in the world, but they also moved toward the cabin. That was when I knew something was wrong. I stepped back from the window, my legs trembling. The figure wasn't just standing anymore. They were walking towards the cabin. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't want to know. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind, but none of them made sense. The storm outside, the isolation of the woods, the sudden appearance of this figure, it all felt wrong. I backed away from the window, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself that I was overreacting. It was probably just someone lost in the storm. Mara had told me about the occasional hiker who wandered too far into the woods, but something inside me refused to believe that. I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wasn't lost. They had been watching the cabin, and they were coming closer. I grabbed the lantern from the table and turned off the stove, trying to make the place look empty, hoping they would just pass by. But my eyes kept returning to the window, to the figure that was now much closer, just beyond the edge of the porch. They were close enough now that I could see their features, or rather, I couldn't. Their face was hidden by the shadows, and the rain soaked through their clothes, making their movements even more eerie, like a person who wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. And Mara hadn't said anything about being back early. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I couldn't move. I stood there, listening to the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, wondering what to do. The person outside didn't speak, just waited, as if they knew I was inside. I didn't know who it was, but I didn't want to find out. I decided not to answer. I stayed still, my eyes glued to the door, my hand trembling against the edge of the table. But when I looked out the window again, the figure was gone. I couldn't believe it. One moment they had been right there, standing in front of the porch, and the next, nothing. The figure had vanished. But just as I thought I had imagined I heard something, a whisper. It was faint, too soft to make out, but it came from behind the door, from the dark, from the outside. And then I heard it again, louder this time, and I recognized the voice. Stay inside. Don't open the door. It was Mara. I didn't know how she had gotten back, or how she knew what was happening, but I wasn't about to question it. I took a deep breath, my mind still spinning, and moved to the back of the cabin, away from the door, away from the window. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't leave the cabin that night. I couldn't. But when morning came and the rain had stopped, the figure was gone, and Mara was still nowhere to be found. The door was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of anyone who had been there. I left the cabin later that day, unable to explain what had happened, what I had seen, and even though the cabin looked just as it had before, I knew one thing for sure. Whoever had been outside that night, whoever had knocked on that door, was still out there, watching, and maybe, just maybe, Mara had known all along. I had always been drawn to the woods. There was something about them. The quiet, the solitude, the sense of being surrounded by something ancient and untouched. I'd been hiking through various forests for years, finding peace in their stillness. But none of the forests I'd been to before were like this one. This forest had an energy to it, something alive beneath the surface that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I stepped in. But I never truly believed in anything unnatural. I thought of myself as grounded, logical, still. This forest was different. I had driven into the small town nearby, just to get away for a while. A weekend retreat, a break from everything, from work, from noise, from the constant hum of modern life. The cabin I rented was tucked on the edge of the woods. A small, rustic place that looked like it belonged more in a fairy tale than reality. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the windows let in just enough light for the entire place to feel warm and inviting, even in the cool, crisp air that clung to the forest outside. The scent of pine and earth was thick around the cabin, seeping in through the cracks in the wood. I didn't know exactly what I expected from the trip, but peace was high on my list. I wasn't prepared for what happened, though. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it walking the trails around the cabin, lost in my thoughts as I hiked deeper into the woods. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches stretching high above me, filtering the sunlight in soft green patterns. I came across a small stream, the water clear and cool, running over smooth rocks, and I paused for a moment, just to listen to the sound. It was soothing, peaceful. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky began to fade into dusk, I sat on the porch of the cabin, a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the forest come alive with the sounds of evening creatures. The air had grown cooler, the evening mist beginning to roll in, but there was still a sense of calm. But that was when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a faint rustling in the trees. But then, I heard it again, a soft whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was distinct. I could almost make out the words, though they were too faint, too quiet for me to understand. I stood up, my heart suddenly racing, my mind trying to explain away what I was hearing. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be. I glanced around, scanning the woods, but there was no one. The trees were still, the mist swirling between their trunks. I stepped off the porch and walked a few paces into the yard, straining to hear. The whispers continued. I froze. The whispers weren't just random sounds, they were voices. Soft, almost melodic, but filled with an unsettling tone, as though they were coming from all directions at once. They were coming from the forest, just beyond the edge of the yard. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. But the longer I stood there, the more real it became. The whispers seemed to be pulling me toward the forest, like an invisible thread tugging at my chest. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what it was. Without thinking, I moved toward the tree line. Each step felt heavy, like the forest was growing darker with each movement I made. The whispers grew louder the further I went, though I couldn't make out any of the words. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stopped, standing still, straining to hear. Help, stay. The words were clearer now, but they didn't make any sense. I turned, looking back toward the cabin. The distance between me and the porch seemed farther than it should have been, like the cabin was farther away than I remembered. The shadows between the trees grew thicker, as though something were hiding just out of sight. I heard the whispers again, closer this time. Stay. With us. A sudden, sharp wind blew through the trees, sending the leaves rustling and making the branches sway. The voices became muffled, as if they were being carried away by the wind. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do, what to believe. I had to get back. I had to leave whatever it was that was pulling me further into the forest. I turned to head back toward the cabin, but my feet seemed too slow, like the earth beneath me was unwilling to let me leave. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, echoing in the distance, like voices in a long-forgotten dream. I quickened my pace, trying to get back to the porch, but as I did, the air grew heavier, denser, as though the forest itself was holding me back. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the path I had taken before, not where it was supposed to be. I had been walking in a straight line, but somehow, I had found myself deeper into the woods than I had intended. The whispers rose to a crescendo, echoing in my ears. Though I could see no one, hear no footsteps, there was nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the cold, heavy air surrounding me. I stopped again, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't explain it. The forest was too quiet, too still, too aware. I looked behind me, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and dark, against the faint light from the cabin, standing just beyond the trees. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow seemed to glide between the trunks of the trees, never breaking the stillness, never making a sound. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape, the figure, but I felt its presence in my bones, a presence that sent a cold shiver through my entire body. I didn't want to see more. I turned and ran back toward the cabin. My feet seemed to trip over the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But as I reached the porch, I stopped. The whispers, the shadow, the figure, all of it had vanished. The forest was silent again, the snow still falling, the trees motionless. I couldn't explain it. The wind had stopped, the voices had stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of being pulled, stayed with me. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy silence. I stayed inside, locking the door and drawing the curtains. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see something outside, but nothing ever came. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in a thick blanket of white, and the night dragged on in an uncomfortable stillness. The next morning, the snow was untouched outside, the world around me pristine and undisturbed. But when I stepped outside, I saw it. Footprints, small, delicate tracks leading from the edge of the woods right up to the cabin's porch. There was no one. No one had been out there. The whispers hadn't been a dream. They hadn't been my imagination. The forest, I realized, wasn't just full of trees. It was full of voices, and it had been watching me, waiting for me to listen. It started with the light. The kind of light you get when the sun is low, casting everything in long shadows, stretching them out like dark fingers reaching across the floor. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was how quiet it was. I didn't hear the usual sounds of the world outside. No birds. No wind rustling through the trees. It was as if everything had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for something. I opened my eyes slowly, disoriented, my head thick with fog. My body felt heavy, as though I had been asleep for too long. I tried to move, but I was tangled in a thick, rough blanket that felt too warm. I pushed it off, my hand brushing against the fabric. It was coarse, unfamiliar, not the kind of blanket I remembered having on the bed before. But my mind was still sluggish, my thoughts not fully formed. I sat up slowly, blinking against the dimness. The room around me was dark, lit only by the fading light from the small window near the bed. The air smelled stale, like dust, like something old and forgotten. It took me a moment to realize where I was, a cabin. But I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, or when I had arrived. The memories felt like they were just out of reach, like something I had forgotten to hold on to. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. The cabin was small, simple. There was a table in the corner, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace against the far wall. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but there was nothing unusual about the place at first glance. No strange objects. No signs of anything out of place. But then, as I made my way to the window, I felt something, a strange sense of unease. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I reached for the curtains, intending to pull them back and let in some light. But when my fingers brushed the fabric, I felt it. The dirt, the grime, the curtains weren't just old. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, the kind that accumulates over years, maybe even decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. The window itself, it was covered, completely covered in dirt, so thick that I couldn't see outside. It was as if someone had piled dirt onto the window, blocking any view of the world beyond. The glass was obscured, but I could still make out the faintest trace of the trees outside, the outline of the forest, but the dirt was suffocating it, blotting out everything else. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. What kind of place was this? Who would cover the windows like that? I couldn't remember being in a cabin like this before, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The air was heavy, the room too still. It felt like I was trapped in a moment that didn't belong to me, in a place that didn't feel real. I made my way to the door, trying to push away the rising sense of panic. It was locked. I tried the handle, rattled it, but it wouldn't budge. I stepped back, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just the window. It wasn't just the dirt. It was the feeling of being caught, of being somewhere I didn't belong. My pulse quickened, and the quiet, oppressive air seemed to grow thicker. I walked back to the window, pressing my hands against the dirt-covered glass. The world outside was still obscured, but I could make out the shapes of trees, their branches, swaying slightly in the wind. I had to get out. I had to see what was beyond the cabin, to understand where I was, to find out what was happening. I moved back to the door again, pushing harder this time, but still no movement. The lock wouldn't give, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if something was keeping me inside, as if the cabin itself was holding me captive. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound. There was nothing, just the stillness, the silence. The sense of unease grew stronger, the feeling of something being wrong pressing in on me. I turned to the table, hoping for something, anything, that would explain where I was, how I had ended up here. There was a small journal on the table, its leather cover cracked and worn. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the writing was still legible. The first entry was dated from several years ago. The handwriting was neat, controlled, but the words felt rushed, desperate. Asterisk, it's been days. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The walls are closing in. The silence is suffocating. I hear things, at night, in the dark. I think they're watching me. They don't want me to leave. I read on, but the rest of the journal was fragmented, disjointed, as if the writer had been too terrified to continue. Some of the pages were torn, others smeared with something dark. The last entry was almost unreadable, the words too blurred to make out. Asterisk, the dirt. It's everywhere now. I can't see outside. The door won't open. They're coming. I dropped the journal, my heart racing. I wasn't alone here. Someone had been here before. Someone who had felt the same things I was. Feeling trapped, watched, suffocated by the silence. And then I realized something. The window, the dirt, it wasn't just covering the window. It was seeping into the room, creeping along the floor, slowly but relentlessly, like it was trying to bury everything in its path. I turned, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. The dirt had begun to collect at the base of the walls, like it was moving, spreading. I ran to the door again, banging on it, shouting, desperate. But no one answered. No one came. I was alone. And yet, the cabin felt crowded. The walls seemed to pulse with something, as if the space itself was alive, breathing in time with my own frantic heartbeat. I turned back to the window, my hands pressed against the dirt-covered glass, and that's when I saw something else, a figure standing outside. I couldn't make out any details, only the faint silhouette of a person, their shape outlined against the dark trees. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, in the snow, staring at the cabin, watching me. But no matter how much I tried to focus, no matter how much I pressed my face against the glass, the figure never moved. It was as if it wasn't real, as if it was part of the dirt, part of the suffocating silence that surrounded me. I turned away, but the figure was still there, its presence haunting the edges of my vision. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The air was too thick, too cold, and I knew, deep down, that I was running out of time. I tried the door again. I slammed my shoulder against it, my fingers bruised from the pressure of pulling at the lock, but it wouldn't budge. The cabin was not letting me out, and then I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant at first, but growing louder, clearer, stay. I turned, eyes wide, heart pounding. The dirt was everywhere now, creeping along the floor, moving like a slow tide, covering everything in its path. Stay with us. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling, my body too weak to run. The figure outside hadn't moved. It hadn't even blinked. But I could hear its voice, coming from everywhere, filling the cabin, filling my mind. The door wouldn't open. The window was covered, and I knew then that I wasn't leaving. The cabin had trapped me, just like it had trapped the person before me. The walls were breathing, the dirt was rising, and the whispers were getting louder. It was the kind of weekend I had been looking forward to for months. A chance to escape the noise, the city, and the weight of everyday life. A simple cabin in the woods, far from civilization, where I could recharge and spend some time alone. I found the place on a small cabin rental website, tucked away on the edge of a national forest. The photos of the cabin were charming, rustic, with a stone fireplace and large windows looking out onto thick woods, the perfect hideaway. When I arrived, I had no trouble finding the cabin. The drive was long, winding through quiet country roads until I reached a narrow gravel path that led deep into the woods. The trees towered over the road, their branches twisting together in a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The cabin itself was just as advertised, a simple one-room structure, with wood paneling, a small kitchen, and a cozy little loft. A stone fireplace stood at one end of the room, with a comfortable armchair next to it, as if it had been waiting for someone to settle in. I unpacked my things and immediately felt the weight of the world slip away. The The stillness of the forest, the fresh air, and the absence of the usual distractions were soothing. I spent the first few hours simply sitting on the porch, watching the wind stir the leaves and listening to the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. But as night began to fall, the quiet grew deeper. The darkness outside the cabin grew thick and oppressive, and I decided to retreat indoors. I started a fire in the fireplace, feeling the warmth spread through the room as the shadows danced along the walls. There was something deeply comforting about the solitude, but also something unsettling, as if the silence was a little too complete. I went to bed early, the exhaustion of the drive catching up with me. The bed was simple but comfortable, the blankets heavy and warm. The wind outside had picked up, but it was nothing more than the usual rustling of the trees. As I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, I felt a deep sense of calm, a rare kind of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. But when I woke up, something was wrong. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I couldn't place where I was. The room was unfamiliar, the angles of the walls strange. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, as I took in the space around me. It was the cabin, but it didn't feel like the same cabin I had fallen asleep in. The layout was off, the furniture in different places. The bed I was in wasn't the one I remembered, and the light from the window seemed wrong. The room looked almost exactly like the one I had fallen asleep in, but the details had changed ever so slightly, but enough to make it unsettling. I stood up, my legs a little shaky, as I tried to process what had happened. I went to the window and looked out. The trees outside were still the same, but the light had changed. It was now a dull gray, as if the sun had set, but I knew it hadn't been long since I had gone to bed. It didn't make sense. Everything felt out of place, as if I had woken up in a parallel version of the cabin. I turned around, looking for the door, but there was no door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no door, no handle, no way out. The frame was there, where it had been before, but there was nothing where the door should have been, just an empty space. I stepped forward and pressed my hand against the frame, hoping it was some sort of trick, a hidden door that I simply couldn't see, but there was nothing. Just empty wood, solid and impenetrable. I ran my fingers over the edges, trying to find some clue, but the frame was smooth, unbroken, untouched. I turned in a circle, my mind racing. The room was small, only one room, with a small kitchen nook and a stone fireplace, the same as before. But it wasn't the same. The space felt wrong. The air felt thicker, heavier, like something was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe properly. My skin felt clammy, my pulse quickening with each passing second. The quiet was deafening, pressing against me. I knocked on the walls, the ceiling, anything that might offer an explanation, but everything was solid. No sounds of life, no answers. I stumbled back to the bed, sinking onto the edge, trying to calm myself. I closed my eyes, hoping it was all a nightmare. Maybe I was still asleep, trapped in a dream. But when I opened them again, the room hadn't changed. The lack of a door was still there. The walls still felt too close. I stood again and tried. The windows, they wouldn't open. I pulled at the latch, but nothing moved. The glass didn't budge. The view outside remained the same. The trees, the thick forest, but it felt distant, unreachable. It was as if the world outside had become inaccessible, like I was trapped in a space that didn't belong to me anymore. Time seemed to stretch on, but the hours didn't pass. The daylight outside stayed the same, a dull gray, as if the sun had frozen in place. I was stuck in the cabin, in this room with no door. I began to feel like I wasn't just trapped in the room, I was trapped in time, as if the cabin itself had become a place out of sync with everything else. The longer I stayed in the room, the more disconnected I felt from the world outside, and that's when I heard it. A sound. It was soft at first, barely perceptible. A faint scrape against the walls, the floorboards groaning. It wasn't the wind outside, or the trees creaking. It was something inside the cabin, something moving. I froze again, my pulse rising. The sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. Something was scratching at the walls, trying to get in. I backed away from the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, and the temperature in the room dropped, as though the very cabin itself was reacting to whatever was trying to get through. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. I couldn't get any words out, only a choking gasp that seemed to hang in the air. And then, the doorframe began to shift. I stood there, watching in horror as the edges of the doorframe morphed before my eyes, the wood slowly splitting open like a mouth stretching wide. I reached out instinctively, but the moment my hand touched the frame, it stopped. The space was still. The opening was gone. I stepped back, my eyes wide with terror. The entire cabin felt wrong, twisted, as though it had been waiting for me to wake up. It wasn't a cabin anymore. It was something else. Something alive, and it wanted me trapped here, with it. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the walls close in, feeling the air press down around me. But the longer I stayed, the less I felt like myself. The minutes, the hours, all blurred together in a haze. Every time I turned away, the cabin would change. The walls would shift, the furniture would move. The world outside remained frozen. It was like the cabin was adjusting, recalibrating. Every time I looked away, and when I finally closed my eyes and opened them again, I was back in the same spot. The doorframe was empty. The window was still sealed, but I could feel the cabin watching me. I don't know if I ever left, but I know this much: I'm still here. The cabin has no door, no way out. It's waiting for me to open my eyes again. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside. It wasn't just the chill in the air, but the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making everything feel still, as if the world itself had frozen in place. The cabin I had rented for the weekend was nestled at the edge of a thick forest, far away from any kind of civilization, and that was exactly what I needed. Peace, solitude, a chance to get away from everything. I'd arrived earlier that afternoon, just as the sun began to set behind the trees. The sky was painted in soft pinks and purples, and the snow, freshly fallen, was untouched. It was quiet here, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your thoughts feel louder than they should. But I didn't mind. The crisp winter air, the smell of pine, the weight of silence, it all felt right. I had unpacked my things, lit a fire in the small stone fireplace, and settled into the warmth of the cabin. But the longer I stayed inside, the more restless I became. Something about the stillness outside, the isolation, was unsettling. So I decided to take a walk, stretch my legs, and clear my head. I pulled on my jacket, laced up my boots, and stepped out the front door, careful not to make too much noise. The snow had fallen thick and heavy, covering everything in a pristine blanket of white. The trees, their bare branches heavy with frost, seemed to stand as silent sentinels, watching over the land. There were no animal tracks, no signs of life, just snow, trees, and the overwhelming sense that I was alone in the world. As I walked away from the cabin, my boots crunched in the snow with each step, the only sound in the otherwise perfect silence. The air felt sharp, like it could cut you, but I welcomed it. The world around me was still, too still. But then, I saw something. I stopped, squinting into the distance. There, just ahead, were footprints, fresh prints, deep in the snow, leading away from the cabin. They were large, heavy footsteps, as though someone had passed through recently. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I hadn't seen any tracks when I first arrived. The snow had been untouched, pure, until now. The tracks weren't mine. They couldn't be. I stared at them for a long moment, wondering if I had simply missed them before, but they were too clear, too fresh, and they led away from the cabin. I felt a strange unease crawl up my spine. Who else could have been out here? I hadn't seen anyone when I arrived. No cars, no signs of life, just the cabin in the woods. I hadn't even seen another person on the drive up. I was sure of it. Against my better judgment, I followed the footprints. I knew it was silly. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and forgotten about it. But the mystery of the footprints tugged at me, and I found myself walking further into the forest. The tracks leading me through the trees, deeper into the snow. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, and the ground underfoot became more uneven, as if the earth itself was resisting my presence. The wind picked up, swirling the snow in unpredictable gusts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I could see no one. The footprints ahead of me remained clear, steady, though I still couldn't figure out who had made them. After what felt like hours, the tracks led to a small clearing, and I froze. There, in the center of the clearing, stood an old wooden structure. A cabin, the exact same size, the exact same shape as the one I had been staying in. The snow around it was undisturbed, no signs of movement, no footprints leading to or from it. Just the one set of prints that led straight to the door. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. There was no way. I had walked away from the cabin I was staying in, and the tracks I had followed had led me here, to this second, identical cabin, standing in the middle of nowhere. I approached it cautiously, my boots crunching in the snow as I moved closer. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a compulsion to check it out. The door was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me, beckoning me to step inside. But something about it, the way it stood there, so still, so quiet, like it had always been here, made my stomach churn. I stood at the doorway for a long time, just staring inside, unsure if I should enter. But the silence of the woods, the oddness of the situation, pushed me forward. My hand reached for the door, and it opened easily, creaking softly on its hinges. Inside was dark, the air stale and cold. I stepped in, my boots echoing in the stillness of the cabin. The furniture was sparse, just a small wooden table, a few chairs, and a fireplace. It looked abandoned, just like the cabin I had been staying in, but it was too similar. Everything was the same layout, the same smell of wood and dust. I turned slowly, taking in every detail. The floorboards were worn, the windows covered in a thick layer of grime, and then my eyes fell on something strange. On the table, there was a book. A thick, leather-bound book, open to a page that looked like it had been marked with something dark. I stepped closer, my heart racing. As I reached for it, I noticed something else, a small, delicate key, resting beside the book. It was old, rusted, as though it had been sitting there for a long time. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to the key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, my thoughts racing. The key seemed oddly familiar, like it belonged to something I had seen before. But what? The answer danced just out of reach, like something half forgotten. Then there was a sound. A soft, whispering sound, coming from the direction of the fireplace. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The fire, which had been nothing more than cold embers when I walked in, now flickered to life, casting long shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the cabin, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He was staring directly at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. I froze, unable to speak, unable to move. The man didn't blink, didn't move. He simply stood there, watching me. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from all around me, he spoke. "You shouldn't have followed the footprints." The words sent a shiver down my spine. My grip tightened around the key, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure didn't move, but I could feel him growing closer, his presence becoming more oppressive. The cabin itself seemed to breathe with him, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening. The air grew colder, the fire flickering violently as though it were fighting against the darkness in the room. I took a step back, but the figure didn't follow. He didn't need to. He was everywhere, filling the space, filling my mind. The weight of his gaze was unbearable. Finally, I managed to turn, my feet stumbling beneath me as I ran out of the cabin. But when I turned to look behind me, it was gone. The second cabin, the one I had entered, was no longer there. The snow was untouched, and the clearing was empty. And when I looked down at my boots, I saw the footprints leading away from the cabin, into the woods, toward the place I had started. The tracks I had followed back to the cabin were now leading me away. But when I tried to walk back, I found I couldn't move. The forest had swallowed me whole, and the only thing I could hear now were the whispers. And the man's voice, still echoing in my head. Asterisk, you shouldn't have followed the footprints. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. But when I finally turned around, I realized that I had been walking in circles. The cabin was gone. The footprints were gone. And now, I was lost in the woods. Again. The cabin had always been her refuge. I remember the first time I saw it, nestled deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization, the kind of place that seemed to exist only in stories or daydreams. A small weathered structure made of timber, with a stone chimney curling smoke into the cold, still air. The outside was a little run down, the wood gray and warped from years of exposure to the elements, but there was something comforting about it, something familiar, the kind of place you could disappear into, and the world would forget about. Her name was Emily. She had invited me to stay with her for the weekend, saying it would be a perfect escape from everything. The stress, the noise, the constant demands of life. I hadn't been sure at first. I had my reservations. The isolation, the distance from the nearest town, the strange quietness of the woods. But she was insistent. It's safe, she'd said. A quiet place to think. No distractions, no people. Just nature. So, I agreed. When I arrived, the air was already cold, the sky overcast and heavy with the threat of rain. The forest around us was thick, the trees tall and dark, their branches twisting together like fingers laced. In a strange, silent prayer. The sound of birds was distant, muffled by the thickness of the woods. We walked through the dense underbrush, her leading the way with the ease of someone familiar with the terrain. The cabin wasn't far, just a short walk from the main road, hidden enough that you couldn't see it from anywhere except the immediate vicinity. Inside, the cabin was warm, a fire crackling merrily in the stone hearth. There was something comforting about the smell of burning wood and the faint scent of pine, the kind that made everything feel like it was wrapped in a cozy, familiar blanket. It was small but charming, with rustic furniture and windows that looked out onto the vast, untouched woods. The dim light from the fire cast long shadows on the walls, and the wind outside began to pick up, rattling the branches of the trees, making the whole world feel distant, disconnected. Emily had settled into a chair by the fire, a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and I had tried to relax. We talked for a while, about life, about how nice it was to be away from everything. It felt normal, comforting even, but beneath it all, something felt off. The air was thick, heavier than I was used to, and the silence outside seemed to absolute, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That evening, as the night grew darker and the rain started to fall in soft sheets against the windows, Emily excused herself to check on the firewood. I stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, the warmth of the cabin cocooning me from the cold that had begun to creep in from outside. The wind howled in the trees, and the rain picked up, the rhythm of it soothing, calming. But as the fire flickered, casting strange, wavering shadows on the walls, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain why. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a feeling, a presence, like something was watching me. I turned quickly, half expecting to see Emily standing there, but the room was empty. The rain outside had become a steady patter, almost like whispers against the walls. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it, I saw something at the edge of my vision, a shape moving across the far side of the room, just beyond the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just the firelight playing tricks on me, the shifting shadows creating illusions. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I waited for Emily to return, my gaze occasionally flicking to the window, to the darkened woods outside, the rain now pouring in sheets, obscuring everything beyond the glass. When she came back, she smiled, her eyes bright and warm. She had The same calm, collected demeanor she always had, but there was something about her that night, something that felt different, like she wasn't fully here, or maybe, like she was hiding something. "You're looking a little pale," she said, her voice soft, as she settled back into the chair. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Just the rain. It's kind of unsettling." She laughed, a soft, knowing laugh, as if she understood exactly what I meant. "It's just the forest. It does that to people. It can feel alive sometimes." She paused, and I could tell there was something else behind her words. "But it's safe here. You're safe. No one comes out here, not unless they know the way." I wasn't sure why, but those words didn't comfort me. They unsettled me more than anything. The way she said them, the way she almost seemed to reassure herself more than me, made my unease grow. I was about to say something when I saw it again. Movement, shadows, just beyond the far side of the room. At first I thought I was imagining it. But when I looked closer, there it was, a figure, standing in the corner of the room, just at the edge of the darkness. A tall, thin shape that I couldn't quite make out. I blinked and turned to Emily. She hadn't noticed it, or at least, she didn't act like she had. She was still staring at the fire, her gaze distant, as though she hadn't heard the slight creak of the floorboards, or the rustling sound like something had shifted in the corner. "Emily," I started, my voice uncertain, "did you see that?" She glanced up, her eyes following mine to the corner. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. The corner was empty. I could feel my heart rate pick up. The air felt thicker again, heavier, pressing down on me, and I could feel the shift in the room. Something wasn't right. Emily looked at me and smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same warm, comforting smile. There was something strange about it, something hidden beneath it. "You're just tired," she said softly, almost too softly. "Don't worry. This cabin, it has a way of playing tricks on people. You'll get used to it." The room felt colder, despite the fire still crackling merrily in the hearth. I nodded, but the unease in my chest grew heavier, like a stone. I tried to push it away, to tell myself it was just the isolation, the strange place, the rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night grew long, and the sounds outside became more pronounced. The wind began to howl again, but this time it sounded different, like voices, soft and distant, calling through the trees. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, like something was trying to speak to me. My thoughts raced. Asterisk, am I imagining it? Is this just the isolation getting to me? I didn't know anymore. I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The shadows in the room stretched and shifted, dancing in the corners of my vision. I pulled the covers over my head, hoping to block it out, but the whispers, they grew louder. The wind had stopped, but the voices didn't. "Stay inside." I heard one whisper clearly, just as though someone had spoken it directly in my ear. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. The room was silent now, but the words lingered, echoing in my mind. I looked to the window. The snow outside had stopped, but the world beyond was pitch black, shrouded in an unsettling stillness. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, unable to sleep, until I heard Emily moving. I turned, but she was no longer in the chair by the fire. She had disappeared into the dark hallway that led to the back of the cabin. And then, I heard it again. The whisper, "Stay inside. They're waiting for you." This time, it wasn't just the wind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, grabbed the lantern, and moved cautiously toward the door. The handle turned in my hand, but as I pulled the door open, I stopped short. There, in the distance, just beyond the cabin, I saw them, figures, dark, blurred shapes, standing, perfectly still in the snow, facing the cabin. Their outlines seemed to shift, like shadows, flickering in and out of existence, but their presence was undeniable. I turned to Emily, but she was standing behind me, a soft smile on her face, a smile that no longer felt comforting. "Don't go outside," she whispered, her voice soft but commanding. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because once you step outside, you can't come back." I looked at her, confused and terrified. The figures outside were still there, but they hadn't moved. They were waiting. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was I still asleep? Had I imagined all of this? Or had I been drawn into something I couldn't escape? I knew one thing for certain. The cabin, the forest, Emily, none of it felt safe anymore. The figures in the snow, their shadows flickering and shifting, they were waiting for me, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward them. The night I arrived at the house, it felt different. There was a heavy stillness in the air, thick and quiet, almost like the world itself had paused, holding its breath. I had rented the place for a few days, needing to get away from the noise of my life. The constant hustle, the endless demands, and the growing sense of burnout had driven me to seek out something remote, something simple. A small, old house tucked away in the woods, far enough from town to feel isolated, but not so far that I felt completely disconnected from the world. The house, at first glance, looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was chipped, the roof sagging in places, and the windows were dusty and cracked. Yet, there was something comforting about it, something that suggested it had been lived in, loved even, at one point. The yard was overgrown, the grass tall and wild, but there was a path leading up to the front door, a path well worn, as if someone had walked it many times before. I had found the key under the old mat, just as the host had said I would, and let myself inside. The door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open, the sound unsettling in the stillness. The house smelled of dust and age, of wood and earth, but there was something else there, too. A faint underlying scent I couldn't place, like something had been burned but was still lingering in the air. I dropped my bag near the door and took a moment to look around. The main room was dimly lit, the light from the windows barely reaching the corners of the space. It was small, a living room, a kitchen nook, and a staircase leading to an upper floor. The furniture was old but comfortable, worn in all the right places. An old armchair sat by the fireplace, a small coffee table beside it. The fireplace was large, made of dark stone, the hearth cold and empty. I set my things down and walked over to the fireplace, deciding to light a fire. It was late autumn, the chill in the air biting at my skin as the evening approached. I arranged the logs carefully, struck a match, and watched the flames slowly catch. For a moment, the house felt alive, as if the fire had breathed life back into it. The room warmed up, the flickering light casting shadows against the walls. I sat down in the armchair, the crackling of the fire soothing, the room now filled with a comfortable heat. But the warmth didn't last. It wasn't long before I noticed that the temperature in the room began to drop again. The fire, which had started strong, seemed to fade, the flames flickering uncertainly, despite my attempts to add more wood. It wasn't the kind of cold you would expect in a drafty old house. No, this was something different. It was the kind of cold that crept in slowly, settling into your bones, making the room feel impossibly vast and hollow. I got up, adjusting the logs, thinking maybe I hadn't placed them properly. But no matter how I arranged the fire, it wouldn't stay lit. The flames died back almost immediately, leaving behind a faint glow that did nothing to warm the room. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, frustrated, but something else began to gnaw at me. There was something wrong with the house. It wasn't just the cold, it was the way it felt. The air felt thick, like something was pressing in from all sides, just out of sight. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been, the space itself feeling off. I stood there for a while, staring into the embers, waiting for the fire to come back to life, but it never did. The house was cold, the heat from the fire now just a memory. I could hear the wind picking up outside, the sound of it howling through the trees, but inside the house there was no warmth. I tried to distract myself. I made a cup of tea and sat at the small kitchen table, sipping it slowly, but the unease only grew. The longer I stayed, the more the house seemed to press in on me. The stillness became oppressive. It wasn't just the cold, it was the way everything in the house seemed to be waiting, holding its breath. Then, as I sat there, I heard it. A sound, a soft, faint crackling, almost like something was burning, but there was no fire. I stood up, my heart skipping a beat, and looked around. The room was empty, the hearth cold, the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The sound was faint at first, like a distant whisper. Then it came again, louder this time, more distinct. Something crackling, something burning, but there was no fire. I turned back to the fireplace. The logs were still there, untouched. The flames were nothing more than a faint glow, and yet I could hear it, the crackling sound, like dry wood snapping, something alive in the air. I walked toward the hearth, my feet slow, almost hesitant, as if I didn't want to look too closely at what I knew was happening. But when I leaned over the fireplace, the smell hit me. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something burning, but not wood. It was almost metallic, sharp, acrid. I recoiled, my hand instinctively covering my nose, but the scent lingered in the air, thick and unpleasant. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening. The fire had gone out, and yet I could still hear the crackling. I was sure the room wasn't heating up, but the air felt warmer, strangely warm, like something was radiating heat from the walls themselves. The house was cold, but it wasn't cold in the way it should be. It was wrong. It was as if the cold was being pushed out, smothered by something else, something I couldn't explain. The heat from the fire that wouldn't stay lit, the crackling in the air that didn't belong. I grabbed my jacket and went to the door, determined to step outside for some fresh air. Something to break the strange, suffocating atmosphere. I pulled at the door handle, but it didn't open. I tried again, harder this time, but the door wouldn't budge. The air around me grew heavier. The house itself seemed to be pressing in, its walls tightening like they were closing in around me. I turned, panicked, and looked for another exit. There was nothing. No windows, no back door. The cold was closing in again, and the house felt like a trap. And then, I heard it again. The crackling, louder this time, sharper, as if something was snapping right behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the soft glow of the embers in the fireplace. But I knew what I had heard. The house wasn't cold. The fire hadn't gone out because of the wood. The fire had been smothered. The warmth had been sucked out of the room by something else, something in the walls, in the air, in the very bones of the house itself. The fire wouldn't go out. It was still burning, but not the way it should have been. It was burning somewhere deep inside the house, somewhere I couldn't reach. And no matter how much I tried, no matter how I rearranged the logs or added fuel, the warmth would never return. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, frozen with fear, the crackling echoing in the silence. When the door finally opened, when it just gave way, like it had been waiting for me, I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't even look back as I grabbed my things and ran into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. I never went back to that house. I don't think I ever will. I don't know if it's still there, but I know one thing for certain. The fire never went out. It's still burning somewhere in the walls, waiting for someone to step inside again. The cabin stood in the woods like a forgotten relic, worn down by years of isolation. I had found it through a rental site, advertised as a cozy escape, ideal for those seeking a break from the noise of everyday life. The photos online were inviting, the warm glow of a fire crackling in the hearth, the thick forests surrounding it, and a lone, peaceful retreat from the world. It was everything I thought I needed. Time to relax, to disconnect, to rest. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. The drive up had been a slow one, twisting through narrow, unpaved roads that seemed to stretch on forever, until the world outside became nothing but trees. I had passed no one, seen no other cars. It was just me and the woods now. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, a quaint wooden structure, its exterior weathered by time. The door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping inside to the smell of wood and dust. There was a fireplace at the far end of the room, and the furniture was simple. A couch, an old wooden table, a few chairs. The kitchen was functional, the bathroom small but clean. It was everything I needed, nothing more, and for that, I was grateful. After unpacking, I decided to start a fire. The air outside had grown colder, and the wind was picking up, whispering through the trees like a distant murmur. I had spent most of the day driving, and the peace of the cabin made me feel like I could finally breathe again. The crackling flames warmed the room, casting soft shadows on the walls, and I sank into the couch with a book, content for the first time in a while. But as the night wore on, something changed. I was half asleep, the fire's warmth lulling me into a doze, when I heard it, a knock. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of something tapping against the window. But there were no windows nearby, only the solid wood of the cabin's walls. I froze, my heart pounding, waiting for the next sound, wondering if I had imagined it. And then, just as I started to relax again, it came again. A knock, clearer this time, sharper. It was coming from the door. I stood up, my legs heavy, my mind still foggy from sleep. I walked slowly to the door, hesitating for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Maybe it was the wind, or an animal, or I didn't know. But the idea that someone was out there in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, struck me with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly, but when I looked out, there was nothing, no one, just the thick darkness of the forest, the wind rustling the leaves. The cold bit into my skin, and I quickly stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind, the cabin settling. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and returned to the fire, hoping the warmth would push away the unease. But the knocking didn't stop. Every hour, without fail, I heard it. A soft knock, followed by a brief silence, then another. It was as though someone was standing just outside the door, waiting for me to answer. Sometimes it would be louder, more insistent, and other times it was so soft that I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But it wasn't. I knew. I could hear it, could feel it vibrating through the wooden floors, through my very bones. At one point, I gathered the courage to open the door again, but when I stepped outside, there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been near the cabin, just the empty woods stretching out into the darkness. It was as if the knocking was a ghostly presence, there and then gone, leaving nothing but the cold to remind me it had ever been. The hours passed, the knocking continuing relentlessly, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling that accompanied it, the sense that something was waiting just beyond the door, something watching, something that knew I was inside. Every time I sat down, tried to read or watch the fire, the knocking would return. My mind began to unravel, each sound amplifying the fear, each hour dragging me deeper into an unsettling sense of dread. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls, and I tried to drown out the knocks with the crackling of the logs, but it didn't work. It never worked. I had never been so aware of the passage of time. The hours stretched on, longer and longer, and I could feel my eyelids growing heavy, my body weak from the stress. It was as if the night had become a living thing, stretching on forever, a dark, suffocating weight pressing down on me. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had no energy left to fight it. The knocking came again. This time, it was louder. It was almost as if it was demanding an answer. My nerves were frayed, my mind too tired to make sense of what was happening. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the door again, too afraid to stay inside, but too afraid to open it. The knocking came once more. I reached for the door handle. My hand trembled as I touched it, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingertips. I hesitated, wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I opened the door. There was nothing, no one, but the ground was different. The snow outside had changed. The cabin's front step, which had been clear when I had stepped inside, was now covered with footprints. Fresh ones. They were clear in the snow. Long, deliberate strides, leading away from the door and into the woods. There were no signs of anyone coming toward the cabin, but the tracks led away. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. I turned around to check the cabin to make sure nothing had changed, to make sure I hadn't imagined the knocking. The door was still open, the fire still burning faintly behind me. I looked back at the footprints. They led into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I followed them. I don't know why I did. Maybe I thought it would explain the knocking. Maybe I was just desperate to end the nightmare, to confront whatever it was that had been tormenting me all night. The snow was thick, the wind cutting through the trees, but the footprints were still there, leading me deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the cold pulling me down, but I couldn't stop myself. The further I went, the colder it got. The woods felt different, more oppressive. The trees were thick, their branches heavy with snow, and the wind howled through them, carrying whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The air was thin, and each breath felt like it wasn't enough. And then, I saw it. The clearing. The place where the footprints ended. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a figure, a man, standing motionless in the snow. His back was turned to me, but I could feel his presence. It was like a weight, pressing down on me. His coat was dark, his shoulders hunched against the cold, and I couldn't see his face. He stood perfectly still, the only movement the slight sway of his body in the wind. I took a step forward, my heart racing, my body trembling. The knocking had stopped. But now, something worse had taken its place. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do. But the longer I stared at him, the more I felt it, the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned and ran, back to the cabin, back to the warmth. I never looked back. When I got back to the cabin, the door was still open. The fire had burned down to embers, but the footprints were gone. The knocking never came again. I left the next morning, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. The only thing that remains are the memories of the cold, the footprints, and the figure in the woods. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted, but I know that I'll never forget the sound of the knocking and the cold, endless silence that followed. The forest had always been a place I found comfort in. There was something about the way the trees stood, towering and silent, their branches reaching toward the sky like ancient arms, that made me feel small in a peaceful way. So, when I decided to take some time off and get away from the chaos of everyday life, the idea of a cabin deep in the woods felt perfect. A secluded place where I could clear my mind and reconnect with myself. A chance to breathe, away from the constant hum of the city. I found the cabin through a friend of a friend, someone who swore it was the ideal escape. A simple place, a tiny wooden cabin tucked in the heart of a forest that stretched for miles. It was far off any beaten path, with no neighbors for miles, just trees and the occasional deer. No internet, no cell service, just the quiet sounds of nature. It sounded perfect. So, I booked it. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already shifting toward dusk. The cabin was exactly as described, old but cozy, with a small stone fireplace in the living room and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. The air inside was cool, but the scent of pine from the surrounding forest seeped in through the windows. It felt like a different world, one that was completely detached from the everyday rush of my normal life. I spent the first few hours unpacking, organizing my things, and getting a fire going. The sound of the crackling wood and the soft patter of the wind outside was calming, almost meditative. After dinner, I settled into the armchair by the fire, a book in hand, enjoying the warmth of the flames. The world outside seemed far away, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't until late that evening, when the storm clouds rolled in and the rain began to fall, that things started to feel different. At first, it was just the sound of the wind, a low, constant hum that made the cabin creak with each gust. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. The storm intensified, and the sound of the rain became a steady, rhythmic beat against the roof. I had closed the cabin door and drawn the heavy curtains on the windows, but the darkness outside crept in, seeping through the edges of the glass. The world beyond the cabin felt isolated, like it was shutting me out. I started to feel an unease, creeping up my spine, a strange tension that I couldn't explain. I looked over my shoulder toward the door as though expecting someone to walk in, but no one did. The cabin was silent again, save for the whispering wind and the crackle of the fire. It was then that I heard it. My name. The sound was faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was my name, clear and distinct, echoing through the cabin. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was no one else here. No one had been around for miles. My first thought was that it was just the wind, a trick of the storm, something in the trees outside causing the sound to carry. But then, it came again. Sarah. The whisper was clearer this time, and it felt like it was coming from the very walls of the cabin, from somewhere deep within the forest. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the forest itself was calling my name. I stood still, staring at the door, the silence pressing in on me. The fire crackled, but the warmth it offered seemed distant, as if the room had grown colder. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no one out there, no one nearby, no one but me. Yet, the whisper lingered, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, urging me to listen, to follow. I walked cautiously to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I opened it slowly, but when I stepped outside, there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and endless, the trees swaying in the wind. The rain had slowed, but the clouds hung heavy in the sky, casting the world in shadows. The only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves, the occasional drip of water falling from the branches. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the soft earth, my breath fogging in the cold air. I could hear nothing but the distant whisper of the wind. But as I stood there, I heard it again, louder this time, clearer, Sarah. The voice wasn't coming from the cabin anymore. It was coming from the woods, the trees, the very earth beneath my feet. I turned, my pulse quickening, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. My name was being called, but there was no one there. No figure standing in the shadows, no shape lurking between the trees. Just the wind and the rain, and the dense blackness of the forest stretching out before me. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and I slammed the door shut behind me. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, more suffocating. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did nothing to dispel the cold that had crept into my bones. The room seemed darker now, despite the firelight, and the walls seemed to press in on me, as though the cabin was closing in, trapping me inside. I tried to shake it off. It was nothing, just my imagination. The wind was playing tricks on me. Nothing more, but the whispers didn't stop. They continued, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. Sarah, come out. It was like the forest itself was beckoning me, coaxing me into the darkness. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't stop myself from listening. The voice wasn't threatening, it wasn't forceful, it was patient, gentle even, like an old friend calling from the other side of a long distance, waiting for me to answer. I grabbed my coat and stepped toward the door once more, the unease rising in my chest like a rising tide. My mind was racing, but I had to know. I had to understand. I couldn't explain it, but something in me told me I had to go outside, to follow the call of the forest. I opened the door again, and this time I didn't hesitate. The air was cold, damp, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The ground was soft underfoot, the dirt slick from the rain. I followed the sound of the whispers, moving deeper into the woods, the trees parting to reveal a narrow path. The further I walked, the more the whispers grew, until they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, distinct and clear, calling me by name. Sarah, we've been waiting for you. I stopped in my tracks. The path in front of me had suddenly opened into a small clearing, and there, standing at the center, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in shadows, their face hidden beneath the hood. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were waiting for me. The whispers had led me here, drawn me into the heart of the forest. The figure took a step toward me, their form moving fluidly through the mist that had begun to gather in the clearing. My heart raced, and my feet felt rooted to the ground. I wanted to run, to turn and retreat to the safety of the cabin, but I couldn't move, I couldn't look away. Then, the figure spoke again, their voice like a soft breeze rustling the leaves. We've been waiting for you, Sarah. You're finally here. And just like that, I knew the forest wasn't calling me out of the night to harm me. It wasn't trying to scare me. The forest had been waiting for me. It had been waiting for a long time. The figure was here to lead me, to bring me into the woods where I was always meant to belong. But just before I took a step forward, something broke the silence. A sound sharp and sudden. The voice, clear and startling, broke through the fog. Don't follow it, Sarah, run. I turned toward the voice, but the figure in the clearing was already gone. The forest had swallowed it up, like it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the voice of reason now fighting against the pull of the whispers. The forest had called to me, but I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. Something in the air had shifted. The feeling of waiting, of something being drawn out over time, was still there, lingering in the spaces between the trees, in the cold wind that blew through the clearing. The forest had been waiting, but for what, I didn't know. and I couldn't stay to find out. I turned, and I ran. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A chance to escape from everything. The noise, the constant buzz of city life, the overwhelming pressure that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I found the cabin through a small local rental agency, advertised as an isolated retreat, tucked away in the woods. A place to disconnect and recharge. It sounded perfect. The drive to the cabin was long, but the kind of peaceful long that made me feel like I was leaving the world behind, bit by bit, as I drove further into the forest. The trees were thick and towering, their branches high above, swaying gently in the wind. The path leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, and the closer I got, the quieter it became. I could already feel the tension easing from my body. When I finally arrived, it was late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its wooden walls worn and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. It looked charming, almost like something out of an old storybook. A tiny, rustic place with a stone fireplace and large windows that promised views of the surrounding forest. I stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as I opened it. The scent of old wood filled the air, and there was something comforting about the musty, quiet atmosphere. The living room was small but cozy, a soft armchair near the fireplace and a few shelves stacked with old books. The kitchen was tucked into the corner, with a small wooden table in the center. I made myself at home, setting down my bags and starting a fire in the hearth. The warmth from the flames slowly filled the room, and the silence around me seemed to grow deeper, more pronounced. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, but inside, it was calm, peaceful. I spent the evening reading by the fire, the rhythmic crackle of the wood comforting in its steadiness. By the time night fell, I was exhausted from the drive and the mental strain of the past few weeks, so I decided to turn in early. The bed in the small bedroom was cozy, and I wrapped myself in the thick blankets, letting the warmth of the fire, still smoldering in the other room, lull me to sleep. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. The air in the room was colder than before, and I noticed the faint sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. It wasn't unusual for an old place like this to creak and settle, but something about the sound felt different. More urgent, like something was pressing in. I rolled over in bed, glancing at the small window near the foot of the bed where the moonlight filtered through, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. The wind had picked up, the trees outside swaying violently, their branches scraping against the roof. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that seemed to have settled in my chest. But then, I heard something, a sound coming from the other side of the cabin. It was soft at first, almost inaudible. A faint tap, like a knock. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound came again, this time louder. A slow, deliberate knock, coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat. Who could be knocking at this hour? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone for the entire drive. I lay there, listening. The knock came again, and then another, each one growing louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, my mind racing. The door was locked. I had checked it earlier, before going to bed, and now, as I sat, In the dark, I was sure of it. No one could be outside. But the knocking didn't stop. I climbed out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. My heart was pounding, the sound of it loud in my ears as I walked toward the door. I had to know. I had to see who or what was outside. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand hovering just above the handle. The knocks came again, this time rapid, like a desperate plea. I felt a surge of anxiety in my chest. What if it was someone in trouble? What if someone had gotten lost in the storm? The wind was fierce outside, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I grabbed the handle, twisting it slowly, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked. I pulled at it again, my breath coming in quick gasps, but it was no use. The door was locked from the inside, the bolt securely fastened. I stepped back, my mind racing. How could that be? How could the door be locked from the inside, and yet someone was knocking at it from the outside? I checked the windows, but they were all sealed shut, the curtains drawn tight against the wind. The small space in the bedroom felt suffocating, the walls closing in as I paced back and forth. The knocks had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had ever been. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind. It had to be the wind, the storm outside playing tricks on me. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I decided to leave the bedroom and check the rest of the cabin. Maybe there was another door, a back entrance, or something that would explain the noise. The hallway outside was dark, but I moved quickly, my eyes flicking nervously over every shadow. The house felt too quiet now, too still. Even the wind outside had died down, leaving only the sound of my footsteps on the wooden floor. I reached the living room and froze. The front door was wide open. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, the night air pouring into the room, cold and thick. The wind had stopped, but the temperature in the cabin had dropped drastically. The fire had burned down to nothing, and the room was bathed in shadows. I looked back at the bedroom, at the locked door that had no reason to be locked. I didn't hear the knocking anymore, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I stepped cautiously to the door, reaching for the handle, but as soon as I touched it, I heard something, a voice, a whisper, barely audible. Asterisk, you shouldn't have opened the door. I jerked my hand away from the handle, my breath catching in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the door, unsure of what to do. It had been open when I entered the room. The wind, the cold, it had all come from the outside. But the door had been locked. I was sure of it. I turned back toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But there was no one there. And then, just as I was about to step toward the back of the house, I heard it. The door, now wide open, slowly creaked shut. The lock clicked into place from the inside. I never stayed in the cabin again.